Chapter 103. Roderick 2. I can. I am going to clean this place. Roderick studied me for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he tried to gauge my intentions. So, you're saying you can handle all the bandits around here? He repeated, his tone skeptical, yet intrigued. But what's in it for you? You're not doing this out of the goodness of your heart. I allowed a small smile to form on my lips, leaning back in my chair. Nothing much, I said casually. Just money would be enough. Roderick's gaze remained sharp, clearly trying to read between the lines. Money, huh? He said slowly. You're a practical man. I'll give you that. But you must know that Rackenshaw isn't exactly overflowing with wealth. The war's taken its toll on everyone here, as expected. But that is fine too, I replied, looking at him. I already kind of expected such a thing, considering the fact that the problem with bandits and other things could be solved if they had enough funds to hire some strong people. The fact that it was not solved alone showed the lack of funds as well. That was why I had another request in my mind. I want an identity as a citizen of the Arcanese Empire. Roderick's eyes narrowed as soon as I mentioned my request, his suspicion flaring up almost immediately. His body tensed slightly, and I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to make sense of why someone like me would want citizenship in the Arcanese Empire. After all, he must have already thought that I was a citizen, since that was the natural reaction. But I was expecting this reaction. There was a reason why bandits were able to roam the outskirts of Rackenshaw so freely. If the city had enough funds and resources, they would have sought help from outside. But their situation showed otherwise. What exactly are you after? Roderick asked, his voice low and cautious. Money wasn't your goal after all, was it? I shrugged, raising my hands in a calming gesture. You don't need to look at me like I'm some sort of criminal. If I were here to cause harm, I wouldn't be sitting across from you drinking tea and negotiating. His gaze remained hard as stone, but I could see the curiosity in his eyes, even if he didn't fully trust me yet. So, what's your game then? Why would you want to become a citizen of the Arcanese Empire? I leaned back in my chair, my expression as calm as ever. Let's just say I have my reasons. And before you ask, no, I'm not an enemy. If I was, I would have acted differently. But right now, all I want is the freedom to move within the Empire without constantly looking over my shoulder. Official citizenship would provide that. Roderick was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. The silence between us stretched out, the clink of his teacup the only sound that broke the tension. I'll be honest with you, Lucavian, he said finally, his tone serious. That's not an easy request. Citizenship isn't something you can just hand out to anyone who walks in off the street, especially with your background. I understand that, I replied smoothly, which is why I'm offering to clean up your bandit problem. I'll take care of what your soldiers can't. In return, I want that citizenship. You can make it happen, can't you? Roderick's lips pressed into a thin line, but I could tell he was considering my offer. Finally, he let out a long sigh. You're asking for something that's beyond me. But I do have contacts who can help with this sort of thing. I smiled. Then we have an understanding. Roderick leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table as he met my gaze head-on. You clean up the bandits, and I'll put in a good word for you. But be warned, it won't be easy. The bandits are more organized than you think. I expected nothing less, I replied with a grin. Roderick studied me for another moment before nodding. All right, Lucavian. We have a deal, but I'll be watching closely. Don't give me a reason to regret this. You won't, I said. Sigh. He released a long sigh, as if he was troubled. Now that we have a deal, I want to ask some questions regarding the bandits. Would that be okay? That is fine. Let me explain everything first. Roderick leaned back in his chair, his expression serious as he began to explain the situation. The bandits you're dealing with aren't just some ragtag group of thieves. Their leader, a man named Corvin, is a peak 3-star awakened. He's powerful, ruthless, and commands a lot of respect among his men. I listened intently as Roderick continued, mentally taking notes on every detail. This Corvin was clearly the central figure I needed to be concerned about. But Corvin isn't alone, Roderick went on, his tone grim. He has at least 5 other 3-star awakened under his command. They're spread out across the region, each leading smaller groups of bandits. That's why we've had such a hard time dealing with them. Even if we manage to weaken one group, the others quickly retaliate or regroup. It's a coordinated effort. So, you're saying that it's not just about taking down Corvin? I said, more to confirm my understanding. I'll need to dismantle his entire network. Roderick nodded. Exactly. The key to bringing down Corvin is weakening his support structure. His lieutenants are the backbone of his operations. Take them out, and Corvin will be vulnerable. But be warned, each of those lieutenants is formidable in their own right. They've been with Corvin for a long time, and they know how to fight. I absorbed the information, and am already planning my approach. Taking out a network like this would require strategy. I'd need to move quickly and decisively, ensuring that none of the lieutenants could rally the others. Or, Roderick must have noticed the gears turning in my head because he added, "There's one more thing you should know. Corvin and his men are deeply embedded in the local area. They've got informants in the towns and villages, and they've been extorting the locals for protection money. The people here are terrified of them, and for good reason. If you make a move against them, it won't stay secret for long." I kind of expected it. Roderick sighed again, clearly troubled by the situation. We've tried everything we can to keep them in check, but without more resources or a higher level awakened, we're stuck in a stalemate. The best we've managed is to contain them, but that's a losing battle in the long run. I get it, I said with a grin, leaning back in my chair. Now that I've heard the full situation, I can say this. Your initial payment offer won't be enough. Roderick's gaze sharpened, his eyes locking onto mine. He didn't seem surprised by my words, though. Instead, he simply studied me for a moment, the weight of the room pressing down on us as he considered his next move. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "That's what I kind of expected," he admitted, his tone resigned but still firm. "So, what do you want?" I leaned forward, my smile widening as I met his gaze head-on. "Not much," I began, my voice calm and measured. "All I want is a reference letter for the Adventurers Guild. Since you're in charge of the garrison here, your word would carry weight. Wouldn't you agree, Knight Roderick?" Roderick's eyes narrowed slightly, but there was no shock in his expression. Instead, he gave a small, knowing nod. "You've done your homework," he said, a note of grudging respect in his voice. "Yes, I hold the title of knight, though I don't often use it these days." "I thought as much," I replied, my tone respectful. "Your authority here is recognized, and a reference from you would open doors for me within the Adventurers Guild. That's all I'm asking for." Roderick leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he considered my request. The room was silent, the weight of our conversation hanging between us. Finally, he gave a slow nod, a decision made. "Very well," he said, his tone measured. "I'll write you that reference letter if you succeed in taking down Corvin and his lieutenants. But know this, Lucavian, if you fail, or if you bring more trouble to this town, that offer is off the table." "Understood," I replied with a nod. "I have no intention of failing." Roderick's lips curled into a small, grim smile. "Good. Then we have a deal. Now, is there a map where I can identify the places where the bandits are staying?" Roderick nodded, though his expression remained serious. "We've got something, but I'll be honest with you. It's not entirely accurate. Tracking these bastards down has been difficult, and we lack the manpower to conduct a thorough search. But we do have some educated guesses about where their hideouts might be." He reached over to a nearby desk, pulling out a rolled-up map. The parchment was worn and creased, evidence of frequent use, and as he unfurled it, I could see markings and notes scrawled across the landscape. The map detailed the region surrounding Rackenshire, with the city itself at the center, surrounded by forests, hills, and a few small villages. This mission, I will reap quite benefits. Chapter 104, Lothar. Roderick tapped a few points on the map. "These are the areas where we suspect Corvin's men have set up camp. But like I said, this is based on what little information we've been able to gather from the locals and the occasional scouting mission. It's not definitive, but it's the best we've got." I leaned in closer, studying the map intently. Each marked location was in a different part of the surrounding wilderness, dense forests, hidden valleys, and even a few near the mountains to the north. They were spread out, which would make it difficult to strike at them all at once. But it also meant that if I played my cards right, I could take them down individually before they had a chance to regroup. This area, Roderick said, pointing to a cluster of markings near the eastern side of the map, is where Lothar, one of Corvin's lieutenants, is believed to be operating. Shadowbrook Village is right here, and from what we've gathered, he's been using it as a base of operations for raids on nearby settlements. We've had reports of increased activity in this area, so it's a good place to start. He then gestured to a spot further south, closer to the city. Here's another suspected hideout. It's a bit closer to Rackenshore, which makes it more dangerous for us. They've been attacking supply caravans and traders, trying to bring goods into the city. We think this might be where Corvin himself is stationed, but again, we can't be sure. I nodded, taking in all the information. It's a start, I said, my mind already working on a plan. I'll begin with Shadowbrook and see what I can find. If Lothar is there, I'll take him down and disrupt their operations. That should weaken their overall network and make it easier to deal with the others. I stood up, feeling the weight of the mission ahead settle on my shoulders. I've got the general gist of things, I said, folding the map carefully and tucking it away. Roderick watched me closely, but I could see a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps a mix of hope and doubt. He wasn't entirely convinced, but he knew I was his best shot at dealing with this mess. Without another word, I turned and made my way to the door, feeling the cool metal of my estoc at my side. The tension that had filled the room slowly dissipated as I left, but the air outside felt charged with anticipation. The task ahead was daunting, but it was one I was eager to face. As I walked down the street, my thoughts turned to the mission Harlan had given me. Deal with the bandits without breaking his sword. I unsheathed my estoc, holding it up to the light. The blade was worn, the edge dull, and chipped in places. It had seen better days, and the task of keeping it intact through a series of battles would be anything but easy. But then again, I wasn't one to shy away from challenges. This blade, I muttered to myself, feeling the familiar weight in my hand. It's been through a lot, but I can't afford to let it fail me now. Vitalyara's voice echoed in my mind. You're taking this pretty seriously, but aren't you worried? That sword doesn't look like it'll hold up for long. I sheathed the estoc, my grip tightening around the hilt. That's what makes it interesting, I replied with a small grin. If it were easy, it wouldn't be worth doing. Always chasing after the thrill, aren't you? She replied with a hint of amusement. Isn't that what makes life exciting? I shot back, my mood lightening just a bit. Besides, this mission isn't just about the sword. It is not just about the sword. I mean making connections with that grumpy old man. Don't you think it will be beneficial? How are you that sure of his talent? That is a secret. Humph. Vitalyara let out a small, playful huff as she leaped onto my shoulder, her tiny paws finding their place on my head. You're pretty crafty, you know that? To think you'd negotiate with the captain of the garrison himself, asking for such rewards. I couldn't help but smile at her observation. Crafty, perhaps, but I'm just being practical, I replied, continuing down the path toward Shadowbrook. What I'm doing here isn't just beneficial for me or Harlan. It benefits almost everyone involved, and that's why I need compensation from all parties. Harlan may be paying for his part, but that's irrelevant to the others. They each have their own stake in this, and I'm making sure they recognize that. Vitalyara seemed to mull over my words, her tail swaying gently as she perched comfortably. You're playing a dangerous game, you know, balancing so many interests at once. It could backfire. No, it won't. Is that so? I will be looking forward to seeing you then. I will be sure to put on a good show for you. In the dimly lit tavern on the outskirts of a village, the air was thick with the scent of alcohol and the low hum of muffled voices. The laughter of men, boisterous and slurred, filled the space, while women in tattered dresses moved between tables, offering drinks and fleeting smiles. The room reeked of decay and indulgence, A den for those who had long abandoned any semblance of honor. At the center of it all, seated at a table overflowing with half-empty mugs and discarded food, was the man they all looked to, the leader of the bandit gang. His greasy hair clung to his forehead, and his fingers lazily stroked the neck of a wine bottle. His eyes, bloodshot from nights of excess, scanned the room with a look of bored superiority. "Give me more wine, girl," he slurred, waving a hand dismissively at a young woman who hurried to fetch another bottle. His attention shifted back to the group of men surrounding him, a mixture of fear and admiration in their eyes. "Tell me again how much we've raked in this week," he ordered, his voice thick with both satisfaction and greed. One of his lieutenants, a scraggly man with a crooked nose, cleared his throat before answering. "We've collected from 3 of the villages, boss. The usual protection fees. They've been paying up without much trouble, though there was some resistance from that blacksmith in Oakfield," the man reported, his gaze darting nervously to the leader. "We dealt with him, though. Ain't no one crossing us after that." A cruel grin spread across the leader's face as he leaned back in his chair, taking a long swig from the wine bottle. "Good. Teach 'em their place. The more they fear us, the easier this gets." Another man at the table, younger and eager to please, chimed in. "The people here, they'll never stand up to us, boss. You've got them wrapped around your finger." "Of course I do," the leader scoffed, tossing the empty bottle aside. "Who else would dare challenge me? I've got the whole damn region under control." His words oozed arrogance, and the men around him nodded in agreement, eager to bask in his reflected power. One of the women leaned in close, draping herself over his shoulders, and he chuckled, clearly enjoying the attention. As his indulgent laughter faded, one of the men seated beside him leaned in slightly, his voice low but steady. Lothar, just a reminder, the meeting time is approaching." Lothar's expression shifted instantly, the smirk dropping from his face as his eyes narrowed in irritation. He grunted, tossing a half-eaten chunk of bread onto the table. "Don't remind me," he growled, his voice dripping with disdain. "You know how much I hate these damn meetings, especially when he's involved." The men around him shifted uncomfortably, well aware of who Lothar was referring to. It was no secret that despite his position as one of Corvin's top lieutenants, Lothar harbored a particular dislike for one of his peers, a man named Alric. Alric was cold, calculating, and always seemed to carry an air of superiority, something Lothar found infuriating. "Alric thinks he's so damn clever," Lothar muttered, more to himself than to his men, his hands clenching into fists. "Strutting around like he's Corvin's right hand, looking down his nose at the rest of us." The man beside him wisely remained silent, not daring to add to Lothar's irritation. Lothar's eyes, now bloodshot from more than just the alcohol, darkened as he took another swig of wine. "I don't know why Corvin keeps that smug bastard around," he continued, his voice a bitter rasp. "He's not as tough as he thinks he is. One day, someone's going to teach him a lesson. Might even be me. Of course, boss. We all know that you are the best." Lothar leaned back in his chair, enjoying the playful attention of the woman beside him as his lieutenants continued to praise his strength and cunning. His mood, soured by thoughts of the meeting, had begun to lighten again as the alcohol took hold and his men fed his ego. "Right. You think so too, sweetie?" he asked, grinning at the woman leaning over him. "MHHMM," she cooed, running a hand through his greasy hair. Just as Lothar was settling back into his usual indulgence, one of his subordinates rushed into the room, his face pale and breathless. Lothar's grin faded, his eyes narrowing at the interruption. "What the hell is it now?" Lothar grumbled, clearly annoyed. "Can't you see I'm busy?" The man hesitated, glancing nervously at Lothar before speaking, his voice shaking slightly. Sorry, boss. There's someone outside. He's asking for you." Lothar raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "And why the hell should I care? Who is this guy?" I don't know, boss," the subordinate stammered, wringing his hands. "But he's young, and he has this scar over his right eye." Chapter 105, Lothar 2. I don't know, boss. But he's young, and he has this scar over his right eye." For a moment, The room fell silent. Lothar's expression darkened as he leaned forward, clearly irritated by the vague description. "Why should I give a damn about some punk with a scar?" he growled, his voice rising. The subordinate swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Because, boss, he's already killed Ruckus, Jake, and Ronan." Lothar froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. The weight of those names hung in the air for a moment, as if it were impossible for him to comprehend what he had just heard. "He killed my men," Lothar repeated slowly, his voice barely contained as rage began to bubble beneath the surface. The subordinate nodded quickly, taking a step back as if expecting Lothar's wrath to erupt at any second. "Yes, boss. Ruckus, Jake, and Ronan. He took them out. We found their bodies outside the village." Lothar slammed his fist down on the table, sending the mugs and plates clattering. "You're telling me some scarred-up kid just walked in and took out 3 of my best men?" His voice was a roar now, his face flushed with anger. Before the subordinate could respond, the door to the tavern suddenly creaked open. All eyes turned to the entrance, where the dim light from outside cast a long shadow across the floor. A figure stood in the doorway, his lean frame silhouetted against the fading daylight. The room seemed to hold its breath as the figure stepped forward, revealing the cold, calculating gaze of a young man. His right eye was scarred, a jagged line that cut through his face, and the faintest hint of a smirk played on his lips as he locked eyes with Lothar. "Oh, you've got quite a setup here," the young man said, his tone light and casual as he took a slow look around the room. His gaze swept over the scattered mugs, the discarded food, and the half-drunken men who were now frozen in shock. He smirked, taking in Lothar's seething expression, before his eyes landed on the 2 women hanging on either side of the bandit leader. "Not bad," the young man continued, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Looks like you were really enjoying yourself, huh? This place isn't half bad. Nice little den of indulgence you've got going here. Good food, good drink." His eyes flicked to the women, and clearly, good company, too. Lothar's face twisted in anger, his fists clenched on the table, but the young man seemed unfazed. He took a few more steps forward, moving with an unsettling ease, his gaze never leaving Lothar's. The room remained silent, everyone watching the scene unfold as if waiting for the explosion of violence that seemed inevitable. The young man stopped at the edge of Lothar's table, his fingers brushing casually against a plate of fruit. With a slight lean to the side, he plucked a single grape from the plate and tossed it into his mouth, chewing slowly as if savoring the taste. He said, his tone still light, almost playful. "Not bad at all. You've really set yourself up nicely here. Shame it's all about to come crashing down." His smirk widened slightly as he locked eyes with Lothar once more, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Lothar's rage was barely contained, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Who the hell do you think you are, walking in here like you own the place?" The young man raised an eyebrow, the smirk on his face deepening as he chewed thoughtfully on the grape. "Who the hell am I?" he echoed, his tone almost mocking. "Is that really important?" Lothar's eyes narrowed, his fists tightening on the table. The men around him shifted uneasily, the tension in the room palpable. Lothar's gaze never wavered from the young man's face, his pride and rage mixing into a dangerous cocktail. "It is important," Lothar growled, his voice thick with menace. "Because if I'm feeling generous, I might just put your name on your grave. That is if you catch me in a good mood." The young man chuckled softly, shaking his head as if Lothar's threat was more amusing than intimidating. "Your humor's not bad, I'll give you that," he replied, the playful edge never leaving his voice. "But we both know this isn't going to end with you being in a generous mood." Lothar couldn't make sense of the situation. The arrogance of this kid, strolling in here as if he had no care in the world, throwing out casual insults, eating his food as if this was just a game. But more than that, something was off. Lothar couldn't sense anything from him. No cultivation, no aura, nothing. As a 3-star awakened, Lothar was used to being able to size up his opponents to gauge their strength. But this young man, he was a blank slate, a complete void. That could only mean one thing. He was at least a 4-star awakened, far beyond Lothar's level. But that couldn't be right. Someone with that kind of power and this young. There was no way someone like that would be here, in a backwater den like this. Lothar's mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. But the longer he stared at the calm, confident smile on the young man's face, the more unsettled he became. There is something about this bastard. An unsettling feeling. It was as if there was something dark about this bastard before him, something that he could not quite make sense of. While he could not see anything or sense, something about this bastard was giving him chills. Before Lothar could act on his rising rage, one of his men, a burly bandit standing just behind the young man, snarled in frustration and drew his sword. Without hesitation, he swung the blade in a wild arc, aiming for the young man's neck. But the moment the sword began its descent, the young man moved. His hand flicked to his side, and in one fluid, almost impossibly fast motion, his own blade was drawn. The sound of steel slicing through the air was crisp, followed by the wet, sickening noise of flesh being severed. Shing! The bandit's eyes widened in shock as the young man's sword carved cleanly through his neck. Blood sprayed into the air in a violet arc, painting the tavern walls in crimson as the bandit's head tumbled from his shoulders and hit the floor with a dull thud. For a moment, the tavern fell into absolute silence, the only sound the soft drip of blood hitting the floorboards. The young man stood in the center, his sword still gleaming with fresh blood, a small, amused smile playing on his lips. "Well," he said, his voice calm and unbothered by the carnage. "I think that's enough talk. Don't you think the same?" Lothar stared at the headless body of his man, his mind struggling to process the sheer speed and precision of the kill. Around the room, the rest of his men tensed, their hands instinctively moving to their weapons, but there was hesitation, fear even, after what they had just witnessed. "Fuck you!" But the tension snapped a moment later as one of the other bandits, driven by rage or panic, let out a battle cry and lunged at the young man, followed by two more of Lothar's men. Their swords flashed as they charged, determined to overpower the stranger. The young man's smile widened just slightly as he sidestepped the first attack with effortless grace, his sword a blur of motion. Clang! Clang! Steel met steel, but the strikes were parried with such ease it seemed almost mocking. Slash! In the span of a heartbeat, the young man cut through the first attacker, his blade slicing cleanly across the bandit's chest. Blood sprayed once more as the bandit crumpled to the floor lifeless. Stab! The second attacker barely had time to react before the young man's long sword pierced through his abdomen, skewering him in a precise thrust. Slash! The third bandit hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes. But it was too late. With a swift, almost playful flick of his wrist, the young man brought his sword down in a lethal arc, severing the man's arm. Eargark! The bandit screamed in agony, but the sound was cut short as the young man's blade found his throat, silencing him forever. In the span of mere seconds, 3 more bodies lay lifeless on the floor. The young man stood still, his expression unchanged, almost as if none of this had required any effort at all. He glanced at the remaining men in the room, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "Well," he asked, his voice casual, almost bored. "Anyone else?" Chapter 106, Lothar 3. "Well, anyone else?" The silence that followed the young man's casual question was thick and suffocating. Every remaining bandit in the tavern stood frozen in place, their hands hovering over their weapons, eyes wide with fear. No one dared move. No one dared speak. The sight of their comrades' brutal deaths had stripped away any illusion of bravado they once had. The young man let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head in amusement. "This is what makes you all such peasants," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "When a weak person stands before you, you bare your teeth, snarl, and pretend you're wolves. But when a stronger one appears," his eyes swept across the room, his smirk widening, "you cower like frightened sheep." The room remained silent, not a single man brave enough to answer. The tension was palpable. the atmosphere thick with the weight of impending doom. The young man's words cut through them like a knife, stripping them down to their most primal fear. No one dared meet his gaze. Satisfied with their silence, the young man shifted his attention to Lothar, whose face had turned a sickly shade of pale. The bandit leader's eyes darted around the room, clearly weighing his options, but it was obvious there was no escape. He was trapped. "There's no need to think of an escape," the young man said, his tone calm but carrying a terrifying finality. His eyes locked onto Lothar's, cold and unyielding. "Everyone in this room is going to die." Lothar's throat tightened, and for the first time in years, he felt genuine fear creeping up his spine. His mind raced, but the truth was undeniable. The young man standing before him wasn't just some wandering swordsman. He was something far more dangerous, far beyond anything Lothar had ever encountered. Lothar swallowed hard, his voice shaking as he finally forced himself to speak. Who are you?" The young man's smirk widened, his eyes gleaming with cold amusement. "Does it really matter?" And with that, the young man's blade gleamed once more, ready to strike. The purple starlight emanated through the air, illuminating everything. "You." Lothar realized that he could no longer avoid the fight. Schlank! He grabbed the axe, which was resting on the ground right, and then channeled his mana into it. Being a 3-star awakened, he was already able to manifest his mana outside of his body and weapon. Lothar roared the sound, a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. He swung his axe in a wide arc, the blade crackling with mana as it cut through the air. A beam of energy shot forth from the swing, a crescent of raw power aimed directly at the young man. The force of the blow sent chairs and tables flying, the ground itself seeming to tremble under the weight of the attack. Without hesitation, Lothar leaped from his chair, using the momentum of his swing to propel himself forward. His eyes were wild with desperation, his axe raised high as he charged the young man, determined to crush him before he could make another move. But the young man, he didn't flinch. Instead, he watched the incoming strike with a calm, almost amused expression, his smirk never fading. As the beam of energy approached, he spoke, his voice light and teasing. Finally decided to fight, have you?" Swoosh! Crack! With a slight shift of his body, the young man tilted just enough to evade the beam, the energy passing harmlessly by him, smashing into the far wall with an explosive crash. Dust and debris filled the air, but the young man remained completely unfazed. His eyes gleamed with a vibrant purple glow as starlight mana began to swirl around him, the air itself seeming to hum with the sheer power radiating from his body. The long and thin estoc in his hand pulsed with the same starlight energy, its blade shimmering with an ethereal glow. Lothar swung his axe down with all his might, the heavy weapon descending like a guillotine. But the young man was ready. In one fluid motion, he raised his estoc to meet the strike. Clang! The clash of steel reverberated through the room as the estoc met the axe. Lothar expected the sheer weight of his weapon, combined with his 3-star strength, to overpower the young man. He was certain the boy would stumble or, at the very least, show some sign of strain. But he didn't budge. The young man's thin, elegant sword held firm against the brute force of the axe, deflecting the strike with almost insulting ease. Lothar's eyes widened in disbelief. His axe was heavy, forged for crushing blows, and yet this boy, this slender kid, had deflected it as if it were nothing. "Is that all?" the young man asked, his tone still light, almost mocking. The glow of starlight around his body intensified, the purple energy swirling faster now as if feeding on Lothar's growing frustration. The young man's blade shimmered, the black starlight that now coated it pulsing with ominous energy. His eyes gleamed with the same ethereal purple as he grinned at Lothar, his mocking tone cutting deeper than the blows themselves. "Well, let me show you how you really need to move." And then, before Lothar could even register the shift, the young man shot forward, a blur of dark energy and speed. It was as if the air itself folded around him, propelling him directly in front of Lothar. The movement was so swift, so precise, that it seemed as though the young man hadn't even moved at all. He had simply appeared. Lothar's eyes widened in panic as the thin estoc gleamed, now only inches away from his chest. He saw it coming, but there was no time, no chance to block, no space to evade. The speed was beyond anything he had ever encountered. Schlunk! The estoc pierced cleanly into Lothar's side, slipping between his ribs with sickening precision. He gasped, his breath catching as the blade slid through his flesh like butter. His hand instinctively went to the wound, gripping at the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt, but the damage was done. "Arre!" Lothar roared as his mana surged from his body in a desperate attempt to create distance. The force of the pulse sent a shockwave through the room, scattering loose objects and forcing a momentary gap between him and the young man. Just as Lothar had anticipated, the boy leaped back with ease, avoiding the mana pulse with a grace that only deepened Lothar's dread. Swoosh! The momentary pause gave Lothar's men the opportunity they needed. With battle cries erupting from their throats, they charged at the young man, their weapons raised high. Lothar, gritting his teeth, clutched at his bleeding side and staggered back, his mind racing. "We just need to tire him out," he thought, eyeing the potion hidden within his pouch. "If we can push him long enough, I can heal and finish him off." The bandits swarmed the young man, swinging their blades and axes with all the fury they could muster. But the boy remained unfazed, his eyes cold and calculating as he watched them approach. For a moment, it almost seemed like he was bored by their efforts. The young man closed his mouth, taking a slow, deliberate breath through his nose. His body remained still as the bandits closed in, and for a split second, time seemed to hang in the air. Then he moved. In one swift, fluid motion, his sword traced an elegant arc through the air, and from the blade, a beam of crescent-shaped starlight erupted. The beam rushed forward on a horizontal axis, slicing through the air with a brilliance that filled the room with an ethereal glow. Slash! The crescent of starlight tore through the room like a silent storm. Everything in its path was bisected with terrifying precision. Tables, chairs, even the walls crumbled as the energy carved through them. The men who had charged forward were caught in the beam's trajectory, their bodies severed in two before they even had time to realize what had happened. Blood sprayed through the air, mixing with the starlight in a macabre display. 5 of Lothar's men, however, had managed to cover themselves in mana just in time. The beam struck their shields of energy, sending them skidding backward but leaving them alive, though visibly shaken by the sheer power they had just witnessed. Lothar watched, his heart pounding in his chest. He could scarcely believe what had just happened. In a matter of seconds, half his men were gone, their bodies lying in pieces on the floor. The few who remained were visibly trembling, their hands shaking as they clung to their weapons. The young man straightened, his sword still glowing faintly with the remnants of starlight. He glanced at the 5 men who had survived, his expression still calm, almost indifferent. "Looks like you have a few left," he remarked, his voice quiet but deadly. "Not that it'll make much difference." Chapter 107, Lothar 4. The 5 remaining men gritted their teeth and wiped the blood from the corners of their mouths. Their bodies trembled with the strain of channeling their mana into their weapons, a clear indication that all of them were 2-star awakened. The air around them buzzed with the weight of their combined energy. But despite their wounds and fear, they stood ready. One by one, the bandits prepared for their final stand. 3 of them, wielding heavy axes, growled as their weapons glowed faintly with the essence of their mana, while the other 2 gripped swords, poison dripping from the edges of their blades. They knew they couldn't outmatch the young man in pure power, but they were bandits, dirty fighters by nature, and they had their tricks: poisons that could paralyze, weapons with hidden spikes, and a deep-rooted instinct for survival at any cost. They attacked all at once, a desperate and chaotic rush meant to overwhelm him. The 3 axemen swung in wide arcs, their blades heavy and menacing, while the 2 swordsmen lunged from either side, their poisoned blades gleaming with malice. The young man, however, remained eerily calm. He moved with the fluidity of a seasoned predator, his eyes cold and focused as the first axeman swung at him. Swoosh! With a single motion, The young man's estoc danced through the air, meeting the heavy axe with terrifying precision. Clang! The axe was cleaved in two as if it were nothing more than paper, and before the bandit could even react, the starlight-coated blade sliced through his torso, bisecting him cleanly. Blood sprayed, and the first man crumpled to the ground in two lifeless pieces. The second and third axemen followed quickly, roaring as they tried to use their sheer strength to force the young man back. One of them hurled a vial of poison at his face, hoping to catch him off guard. As expected, but the young man was far too quick. He sidestepped the vial effortlessly, his estoc carving a lethal path through the air once more. A blinding flash of starlight cut through the second axeman's chest, sending his body falling in halves to the blood-soaked floor. The third axeman tried to bring his weapon down in a powerful overhead strike, but he never had the chance. With a quick thrust, the estoc pierced straight through his throat, ending his life in an instant. His body slumped to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. The two swordsmen, realizing the hopelessness of their situation, tried to retreat, but the young man gave them no such opportunity. He surged forward, his body a blur as he cut through the first with terrifying precision. The poison on the man's blade never even came close to reaching its mark. A clean slice through his abdomen, and the bandit was gone. The final bandit swung wildly in a panic, his poisoned sword barely grazing the young man's shoulder. But the attack lacked any power or conviction, and the young man dispatched him with a quick, decisive strike. The estoc flashed once, and the last man fell to the ground in two pieces. None of the five had lasted more than 2 moves. The tavern was now quiet, save for the sound of blood dripping from the corpses littering the floor. The young man stood amidst the carnage, his blade still gleaming with black starlight, his expression calm as ever. The young man turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Lothar, who stood frozen amidst the wreckage of his men. Lothar's body was still trembling, his hand gripping his bleeding side as he struggled to comprehend the scene before him. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat filled with the cold realization that death had just swept through his gang like a storm, and now it was his turn. The young man took a step forward, his expression calm, almost bored. "So," he asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "are you coming or not?" Lothar met his gaze, swallowing the lump of fear that had formed in his throat. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, trying to find some meaning in what had just happened. Desperation flickered in his eyes as he finally managed to speak. "Why?" Lothar asked, his voice trembling, barely more than a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" The young man tilted his head slightly, his brow furrowing in mild confusion. "What do you mean by why?" he asked, his voice calm and measured as if the question itself were nonsensical. Lothar coughed, wincing as the pain in his side flared up. "With your talents, you could find a job anywhere," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Why waste your time here, in a backwater like this? Why bother with us?" The young man's lips curled into a small, almost thoughtful smile. He nodded slightly, acknowledging Lothar's point. "You're not wrong," he said, his tone surprisingly conversational. "With my talents, as you say, I could find something much more rewarding." He paused, his gaze shifting briefly to the carnage around them before returning to Lothar. "But you and Corvin, well, you're just unlucky," he continued, his voice carrying a sense of inevitability. "Because the circumstances led me here." Lothar's breath caught in his throat, the weight of the young man's words sinking in. There was no grand purpose, no deep vendetta. They were simply unfortunate, caught in the path of a force far beyond their understanding or control. "Unlucky," Lothar repeated, his voice barely audible. The young man gave a small nod, his expression unchanging. "That's all there is to it," he said, his voice calm. "If I were to be born as a normal noble or as a normal citizen of Arcanes, I would not be here doing this. At the very least, you would have your life here, and once a team to subjugate you was sent, you could get the intel and leave. But there was no way you could expect someone like me. Isn't that right?" Lothar nodded weakly, his mind piecing together the grim reality of the situation. That's how it goes," he muttered, his voice shaking as the weight of it all pressed down on him. We've always known how to play the game. Move before they catch up. Keep the right people on our side. Bribe the officials and pay off the scouts. It's always worked until now. He coughed, blood spilling from his lips as the pain in his side flared once more. His grip on his axe weakened, and he leaned heavily against the wall to stay upright. But we never heard about anyone like you, he continued, his voice bitter. No warnings, no rumors. That means you're not affiliated with anyone, are you? Not part of the usual system. The young man's gaze didn't waver. His calm expression remained unchanged, though a flicker of acknowledgment passed through his eyes. That's correct, he replied softly. I'm not bound to any of the corrupt officials you've bribed, nor am I part of the regular forces you've been dodging. Lothar let out a weak laugh, filled with disbelief and resignation. So that's it. We were playing our usual game, and you weren't even on the board. We were just unlucky. The young man raised his blade, its surface still shimmering with the remnants of the dark starlight that had left nothing but destruction in its wake. He stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Lothar's with an almost unsettling calmness. No, they were not calm. They were different. There was a slight sense of greed in those eyes, a sense of happiness. This guy, he is a demon. Indeed, the guy's eyes were smiling as if he was enjoying the situation himself. Lothar could feel the weight of his own mortality pressing down on him as he stared back, the bitterness of his defeat sinking in deeper with every passing second. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body failing him as the wound in his side continued to drain his strength. The young man's voice cut through the stillness, soft but firm. Indeed, but don't worry. He paused, the tip of his estoc gleaming in the faint light as he raised it slightly. You won't be alone. Lothar's heart skipped a beat, his eyes widening in a mix of fear and understanding. The young man's gaze didn't falter as he continued, his tone as calm as ever. All of your friends, every one of them, they'll follow you. Just like you. They'll meet the same end. One by one. Even the one you dislike, his name. What was it? Ah, Alric. Everyone. And then his smirk widened. Just to inform you. The people that you think escaped to inform Corvin, they are all dead. So, you don't need to buy time. At that exact moment, Lothar's fading hope was crushed entirely. From the entrance of the tavern came a soft, dragging sound. His head snapped toward it, and what he saw made his blood turn cold. A small cat padded into the room, its sleek, midnight black fur glistening in the dim light. But what caught Lothar's attention was the bundle behind it. A group of men bound in thick ropes made of glowing manna, their bodies dragged effortlessly along the floor. Every one of the bound figures was a familiar face. These were the bandits who had escaped just moments before, now tied and gagged, their eyes wide with fear and defeat. Lothar's breath hitched as the cat, seemingly indifferent to the weight it was pulling, stopped in front of the young man. The cat glanced up at him, its eyes shimmering with a sharp intelligence, far beyond any ordinary animal. The young man looked down at the cat with an almost playful smile. Vitaliera. Good work, as always. Chapter 108. Lothar 5. Vitaliera. Good work, as always. The cat let out a soft purr in response, its tail swishing back and forth lazily as it sat beside the bound bandits, who were now squirming in their restraints, their muffled cries of panic filling the air. Lothar's heart sank. This was it. The last hope of escape, of survival, had been dashed. The very men he had relied on to escape and warn Corvin had been caught. No, hunted down and dragged back like prey. The young man turned his gaze back to Lothar, his expression unchanging. Now, he said, taking a step forward and raising his estoc once more. I believe we can now start talking with our blades, no? Lothar's eyes flickered with renewed determination, the fear and desperation momentarily replaced by a savage resolve. He would not go down without a fight. His pride, his strength, his reputation. None of it would allow him to simply lie down and die. With a guttural roar, Lothar surged forward, his body suddenly invigorated. The wound in his side that had drained his strength moments ago began to seal itself, his internal mana surging to accelerate his healing. His body mended with unnatural speed, and he knew this moment of surprise would be his best and perhaps last chance. Most people wouldn't expect such rapid recovery. Most would think him too weak, too wounded, to launch a full attack. But Lothar was going to show this bastard his true strength. His axe, heavy and menacing, flared to life as it became engulfed in flames, the bright red-orange mana coating the blade with a crackling intensity. The art he had trained for years, the flame cleaver, roared to life, his fiery mana spiraling around him in a blazing aura. Heat radiated from his body as he channeled everything into his next strike. The flames danced along the length of his axe, growing brighter and fiercer with each step he took toward the young man. "I'll burn you alive," Lothar bellowed, his voice filled with both rage and determination. His muscles tensed, and with all his strength, he swung the blazing axe toward the young man, the air sizzling from the sheer heat and force of the strike. The flames leaped from the blade in an arc, a wave of fiery mana streaking toward the young man, intent on consuming him. But the young man merely watched. With a calm, almost amused expression, he observed Lothar's desperate attack, the fire closing in fast. At the very last second, the young man's body moved. In a single fluid motion, his estoc glinted with that ominous black starlight once more. His eyes, glowing with purple energy, tracked every movement of the incoming flames. Void Starfall Blade. Starline. Clang. The estoc met the flaming axe, but instead of being consumed by the fire, it cut through the blazing energy with terrifying ease. The force of Lothar's strike was deflected, the flames dispersing harmlessly as the young man's sword cut through the wave of heat like it was nothing more than air. Lothar's eyes widened in disbelief as his full-powered attack was rendered meaningless. But before he could even process it, the young man struck back. Swish! With a lightning-fast strike, the young man's estoc slashed through the air, meeting Lothar's body with such precision and speed that the bandit leader had no time to react. The blade cut through his flesh, piercing deep into his chest. Void Starfall Blade. Eclipse Star Trail. Lothar gasped as the young man's estoc pierced through his chest with unnerving precision, the blade sinking deep into his flesh. For a brief moment, pain surged through his body, but his instincts kicked in, and he forced himself to keep moving. This won't be enough to take me down, Lothar thought grimly, gritting his teeth as he mustered his strength. As a 3-star awakened, his body had been tempered through countless battles. His physical resilience was something he prided himself on, capable of enduring hits like this multiple times. A twisted grin spread across his face as he felt the fire still surging through his veins, his axe glowing with the mana that fed his flames. "You think this is enough to stop me?" he growled, his eyes wild with desperation. He raised his hand, preparing to unleash the hidden spell he had kept up his sleeve for moments like this. His final gambit. Boom! An explosion of fire erupted around him, flames scorching the air in a violent burst. The heat roared outward, consuming the space between him and the young man, creating a wall of destruction. But something was wrong. Lothar's grin faltered as he felt a sudden, unnatural pull from within. The mana in his body, his own energy, wasn't responding as it should. His flames flickered erratically, and instead of surging with power, his mana began to churn, spinning out of control. He coughed, his body shaking as his mana refused to follow his commands. Panic set in as he realized that something was horribly wrong. His mana core, was going berserk. The flames he had summoned sputtered and died out, leaving him standing in a pool of failure and agony. He stumbled, his hand clutching at his chest as the sensation of his mana spiraling out of control grew stronger. It was as if the very core of his being was tearing itself apart. The young man watched with an eerie calm, his eyes glowing with that same purple energy. He took a step closer, his blade still glistening with the ominous black starlight, and met Lothar's gaze, his expression unreadable. "You can feel it, can't you?" the young man said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "The instability. Your core is about to explode." Lothar's eyes widened in horror as he gasped for breath, his body trembling. His mana was spiraling, going wild inside him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The young man's voice was cold and precise as he continued, his gaze unwavering. "If you want to stop this, there's only one way." Lothar tried to speak, but his voice came out in a ragged, desperate croak. He could feel the pressure building inside him, his core on the verge of shattering. "Tell me the location of your main base," the young man said, his words sharp and cutting. "Though I can find it myself, I'd rather save the trouble. Do that, and I'll stop your core from going berserk." Lothar's face contorted into a smirk, his lips twitching with bitter amusement despite the agony coursing through his body. He coughed, blood spilling from his mouth as he struggled to speak. "Do you think I'm a fool?" he rasped, his voice weak but laced with defiance. "You're not promising to save me, just to stop my core from exploding, which means you'll kill me the moment I tell you where the base is." The young man's expression didn't change, but there was a slight flicker of amusement in his eyes. He nodded calmly, acknowledging the truth in Lothar's words. "Of course," he replied with a smile. "Isn't that the sort of strategy you bandits often employ? I figured I'd try it once, see how it felt." Lothar let out a weak, gurgling laugh, the sound hollow and strained as blood dripped from his lips. He spat on the ground, his smirk still intact despite the growing horror of his situation. "Go to hell, you bastard," he spat, his voice defiant even in his last moments. The young man tilted his head slightly, a faint, almost disappointed sigh escaping his lips. "I suppose that's your answer then," he said quietly, shaking his head as he took a step back. Without another word, the pressure inside Lothar's body reached its breaking point. His core, unable to contain the wildly spiraling mana, gave way. Boom! Lothar's insides exploded in a violent eruption of energy, his body convulsing as the force tore through him from the inside out. Blood sprayed from his mouth and nose as his limbs jerked uncontrollably, the violent release of mana sending shockwaves through his body. His eyes widened in one final, silent scream before everything went dark. His body collapsed to the ground, lifeless, the remnants of the explosion still shimmering faintly around him. The young man stood over the corpse, his expression calm and indifferent. He sheathed his estoc, his gaze lingering on Lothar's remains for only a moment before turning away. "Such a waste," he muttered under his breath. Vitaliera padded up beside him, her eyes glinting in the dim light as she let out a soft purr. "Looks like I'll have to work a little bit more." With that, the young man turned to face the remaining bandits, who were now staring at him with wide, fearful eyes. Their faces were pale, and they stood frozen in place, trembling as they processed what had just happened to Lothar. The room was thick with the stench of blood and death, and the weight of their impending doom pressed down on them. The young man's lips curled into a smirk, his eyes gleaming with that familiar, cold amusement. He crossed his arms casually, as if completely unbothered by the carnage around him. "Well then," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of menace, "it seems we've come to a bit of a crossroads, haven't we?" He tilted his head slightly, his gaze flicking over the terrified faces of the bandits. "I'll make this simple," he continued, his tone almost conversational. "Those who choose to speak and tell me what I want to know, well, at least you'll have the dignity of a proper burial." His smirk widened, and he gestured casually toward Lothar's lifeless body, still twitching from the aftermath of the explosion. "As for those who choose to stay silent, well, you'll end up just like him." The bandits' eyes darted toward Lothar's remains, a collective shudder running through them. The sight of their leader's twisted, blood-soaked corpse sent chills down their spines. They had seen death before, caused it, even, but nothing like this. The silence stretched, and the young man let it linger, savoring their fear. "So," he said, his voice sharp and cutting, "who's going to speak first? You have 10 seconds. Chapter 109. Loren. The inn was eerily quiet now, the heavy stench of blood and death permeating the air. The bodies of the bandits lay strewn across the room, lifeless and cold, their mana dissipating into the ether. I sat in the middle of it all, cross-legged on the blood-soaked floor, my hands resting on my knees as I breathed in the death around me. The flickering starlight that had once danced across my estoc was now dim, the purple glow fading into the shadows as the energy of those I'd killed began to seep into my body. It was subtle, but I could feel it, the mana of death, flowing like a river, coiling around my core and infusing my body with cold. It's different. I closed my eyes, allowing myself to focus on the sensation. Human death. It had a strange quality to it, stronger, richer than the death mana I'd absorbed from monsters in the past. It was almost intoxicating, this thick, potent energy that filled the room. Humans give off more death mana than most monsters. Why? It was a question that I noticed. What made humans so potent in death compared to beasts? Monsters were stronger in life, their mana often more vibrant and powerful, but in death, humans left behind something more substantial. Was it fear? Emotion? Regret? All those human qualities that lingered even after life had left them. I wasn't sure, but I could feel it in the air, the echoes of their final moments. The terror, the pain, the desperation. It clung to the death mana, making it heavier and richer. But what about it made the difference? Maybe because I am a human too. I meditated on that thought for a while, letting the death mana circulate through my core. Each breath pulled it deeper into my being, and with every passing second, I felt myself grow stronger. But no answer came. Nothing tangible I could grasp. Before I could dwell on it further, Vital Yara's voice broke through the quiet. "Did you really have to kill everyone here?" she asked, her tone not accusatory but curious. I opened my eyes slowly, glancing down at her. She sat beside me, her black fur sleek and untainted by the blood that surrounded us, her green eyes watching me intently. "Did I?" I murmured, repeating her question aloud as I considered it. My gaze drifted back to the bodies lying in disarray around the inn. Men who had spent their lives taking what they wanted, killing for their own gain, and extorting the weak. And now, they had become part of the cycle of death. Vital Yara's eyes narrowed slightly. I understand the reasoning. But was it necessary to kill every last one? Some of them could have been spared, couldn't they? I chuckled softly, shaking my head. Spared? You know better than that, Vitaliera. The moment I let even one of them live, they would have spread the word about me. And you know how things work. It's not just about survival. It's about reputation. These bandits, if I'd left any of them alive, I'd only be inviting trouble. So, it's about reputation. She pressed. You are not the one to care about such things. Well, that's indeed not the reason, I admitted, my eyes falling on one of the lifeless faces nearby. They chose this path. They preyed on the weak, killed without mercy, and lived by a code of power. It's only fitting that they died by that same code. He not bad. Was that another test? Just to see if you can survive for long? Vital Yara's voice lingered in my mind. Those who act heroic and believe in second chances often don't get one themselves. I couldn't help but smile at that, nodding as I rose to my feet. That rhymed well, I mused, brushing the dust from my coat. The death mana in the room had been fully absorbed, leaving a strange emptiness in the air where the life force had once lingered. The tavern now felt like a hollow shell, a graveyard for the souls that had once thrived on greed and violence. As I started to walk toward the door, I glanced down at my estoc, its once gleaming surface now marred by new scratches and dull spots. The blade, which had once been a testament to precision and elegance, was beginning to show signs of wear from the skirmish. "Tisk," I muttered under my breath, inspecting the blade with a critical eye. "Not my best work." Vital Yara's voice chimed in with a teasing edge. "You played around quite a bit in there. If you hadn't toyed with them so much, your blade might have been in better shape." I sighed, flipping the estoc in my hand and sheathing it with a soft click. True enough, I got a little carried away. But then again, it was entertaining. "Entertaining for you, maybe," she replied, her voice tinged with amusement. "But now look at your sword. You're going to have to deal with it before long, or else it'll fail you at the worst moment." "I know," I grumbled. As I strolled through the quiet streets, I could feel their eyes on me. The people who dared to peek from behind windows or glance as I passed didn't hide their fear. It was in their quickened steps, the way they clutched their belongings tighter as if proximity to me might somehow taint them. A few whispers spread, but none dared to approach. It was funny in a way, watching how they recoiled as if I were some sort of beast. Well, perhaps I was. After all, I had just beheaded a bunch of their local tormentors in cold blood. Even now, the faint scent of iron clung to my clothes, and some streaks of blood had dried on my sleeves. To them, I must have seemed like some kind of executioner. Humph, I mused, shaking my head with a small smile. I'm not here for their approval anyway. The fear in their eyes didn't discourage me. If anything, it was a sign that things were unfolding exactly as they should. Fear is the natural way of things. Fear of the strong. Fear of death. Fear of the unknown. It kept people in line and made them understand the reality of this world. Whether they viewed me as a savior or a monster didn't matter. They wouldn't challenge me. And that was the point. It was easy for them to forget that in the chaos of war, people like me were often the ones keeping them alive, whether by subduing threats or simply being someone too dangerous for others to attack. As long as I got the job done, their opinions meant nothing. Vitaliera stirred atop my head, her soft fur brushing against my skin as she shifted. They're looking at you like you're a monster, she commented, though her tone was more amused than concerned. I wonder why, I replied dryly. I only decapitated a few people right in front of them. People they hated, but people nonetheless. You seem to enjoy it, though, she teased. I shrugged. Fear is a tool. Let them fear me. At least then they won't become a problem. Heh! And you wonder why they won't look you in the eye, she snickered, her tail swishing lazily. I smirked. As long as they stay out of my way. I don't care what they think. That was how things needed to happen anyway. But now, I need to move fast. They will eventually find out about this, won't they? Indeed. I glanced around at the fearful faces, knowing the clock was ticking. The bandits wouldn't stay in the dark for long. Word would spread, and Corvin's men would start sniffing around, trying to piece together what had happened. And when they did, the people here, innocent or not, could easily become targets. The bandits might assume I'd done this to protect someone in town, that there was a connection they weren't aware of. That's how their minds worked. Revenge through proxy, through the weak and vulnerable. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that these people could suffer for no reason at all. Vitaliara's tail flicked lazily as she perched atop my head. So, what's the plan? The plan, I replied, my tone firm, is to move fast, before Corvin's men can regroup or retaliate. If they think someone here is responsible, they'll start picking off targets. Better to cut them down at the source before they get a chance. The locations I had gotten from Roderick and some other bandits were invaluable. It gave me the freedom to move, to hit the bandits before they could organize any sort of counterattack. I knew that taking out Lothar and his crew was just the beginning, but with their network spread thin, I could exploit the gaps and gather even more information as I went. And not all the bandits know about the entire network, I thought. While interrogating them, there were still some locations that were blank. But this should be enough. Eventually, we would be getting there anyway. That was what all mattered at the end. Chapter 110, Loren 2. The road was long and dusty, stretching out beneath the caravan's wheels as they rolled slowly along the worn path. The caravan, modest in size, was made up of several wooden carts pulled by tired horses, each cart laden with burlap sacks and crates filled with agricultural goods, grain, dried fruits, and various crops. The goods themselves weren't anything rare, but they were valuable now, given the scarcity in the region. Rakenshore and its surrounding villages had been plagued by bandit raids for weeks, making it difficult for any merchant to move goods safely. At the front of the caravan sat a young merchant, his hands tightly gripping the reins of his horse. His name was Edric. He was new to the trade, barely a year into his venture, but already he was feeling the crushing weight of the market's unforgiving demands. His face was tense, a mixture of worry and determination etched into his features. This caravan, this load of goods, was his last gamble, a desperate play to save his business from collapsing. Edric glanced over his shoulder, watching the carts behind him with growing anxiety. The goods were cheaply bought from a city that had no choice but to sell at a low price, their coffers drained by bandit raids and the ongoing conflict in the region. The plan had seemed perfect at first: acquire the goods for next to nothing, transport them back, and sell them for a tidy profit to those in need. But now, as he rode through the sparse countryside, the reality of the situation weighed on him heavily. He had barely any budget left after purchasing the goods, and that meant cutting costs where he could, including hiring protection. He had only managed to scrape together enough coins for a few guards, and even then, they weren't the most experienced. The group of guards rode beside the carts, their eyes scanning the horizon nervously. They were well aware of the dangers that lurked on these roads. Bandit activity had surged in recent weeks, and the routes between towns had become treacherous. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound, set them on edge. Edric bit his lip, his mind racing with thoughts of what could go wrong. If the caravan was attacked, his goods would be lost. Worse, if he failed to deliver them, his business would collapse entirely. Everything he had worked for would vanish. "I can't fail," he muttered under his breath, trying to reassure himself. "I have to make this work. I have to." The road ahead wound through a dense stretch of forest, and Edric's stomach tightened as they approached it. The forest was known to be a prime spot for ambushes, a place where bandits could hide and strike without warning. He glanced at the lead guard, a gruff man named Garvin, who met his gaze with a stern nod. They both knew this was the riskiest part of the journey. As the caravan entered the shadowed path between the trees, the tension grew thicker. Edric could hear his heart pounding in his ears, and he kept a close watch on the tree line, his hand never far from the small dagger at his waist. He prayed they would make it through unscathed, but deep down, he knew that this gamble might cost him everything. The wind rustled the branches, and for a moment all was quiet. Too quiet. The silence before the storm. Just as the caravan moved deeper into the forest, the unsettling silence was broken by a sharp whistle from the treetops. In an instant, shadows shifted among the foliage, and before Edric could fully grasp what was happening, bandits poured out from both sides of the path, weapons glinting in the dappled sunlight. They moved quickly and with practiced precision, surrounding the caravan in a deadly semicircle. "Bandits!" one of the guards shouted, drawing his sword as the others readied themselves for battle. Edric's heart raced, panic clawing at his throat. This was exactly what he had feared. Garvin, the lead guard, snarled as he raised his weapon. "Stay back, Edric. We'll handle this." For a brief moment, hope flickered in Edric's chest as the guards charged toward the approaching bandits. Steel clashed against steel, and the forest erupted into the chaotic sounds of battle. But something about it felt off. Then it happened. Garvin, instead of striking down the nearest bandit, lowered his sword with a cold smirk. The other guards followed suit, stepping back as the bandits closed in around Edric. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. They weren't fighting. They were part of the attack. "You really thought we'd risk our necks for the pocket change you offered?" Garvin sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're dumber than I thought, Edric. No one takes on a suicide job like this without a better offer on the table." The other guards laughed, their eyes glinting with mockery as they dropped all pretense of loyalty. One of them, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, casually strolled over to one of the carts, kicking a sack of grain over as if it was worthless. Edric's mouth went dry. You were with them all along," he stammered, his mind spinning as the full weight of the betrayal sank in. Garvin chuckled darkly, wiping the blade of his sword on his sleeve as he looked down at the terrified merchant. "Of course we were. You made it easy for us. Desperate, green, and too eager to believe you had a chance." One of the bandits, a hulking brute with a wild beard, stepped forward, grinning. "Thanks for doing all the hard work for us, Mr. Edric." Edric's knees buckled as fear coursed through him. Everything he had worked for, all the risk, all the planning, was slipping away right before his eyes. He tried to muster some sort of response, but his voice failed him, the enormity of the situation paralyzing him. "Don't look so sad," Garvin jeered, stepping closer. "You're not the first merchant we've bled dry, and you won't be the last. You were just easier than most." The bandits closed in on the caravan, laughing and jeering as they began to ransack the goods, tossing crates and sacks onto their own carts. Edric could only watch helplessly, his last gamble crumbling before him as the reality of his doomed venture became all too clear. At least, that was how it was supposed to be. Just as the bandits began ransacking the goods, their laughter and jeers filling the air, a sudden gust of wind blew through the trees. It was subtle at first, but then came the soft sound of footsteps, too soft, too deliberate. Garvin paused mid-laugh, his senses prickling as if something was off. He turned his head toward the tree-line, just in time to see a shadowy figure step into the clearing, the young man with the scar on his right eye. Before anyone could react, he moved with a speed that defied reason. In one fluid motion, his blade flashed, catching the sunlight for the briefest of moments before it descended. Slash! The first bandit's body was bisected cleanly, his expression frozen in shock as his torso slid apart from his legs. Blood sprayed across the ground as the young man moved like a specter through the clearing, his long, thin estoc cutting down the remaining bandits with surgical precision. Swoosh! Another bandit's head rolled to the ground, followed by the sickening sound of bodies crumpling. The chaos lasted mere seconds. One breath, and it was over. Where there had been a jeering gang of bandits, now only a few twitching corpses remained, their blood pooling on the dirt road. The young man stood in the middle of the slaughter, his expression calm, as if none of it had required any effort. His eyes scanned the clearing, cold and calculating, before locking onto the one bandit he had deliberately left alive. It was Garvin, who had fallen back in sheer terror, his face drained of color as he stared up at the young man with wide, trembling eyes. The young man took a step closer, his blade still dripping with blood, and tilted his head ever so slightly. "Where is Loren?" His voice was low and cold, every word laced with dangerous intent. Garvin's lips quivered, but despite the terror coursing through him, he remained silent. His loyalty, misplaced as it may have been, kept him from betraying his leader. He looked like a cornered animal, too scared to move yet too stubborn to answer. The young man let out a quiet sigh, shaking his head in mild frustration. "Why are you all so loyal to someone like him?" he muttered, almost to himself. "It's a shame." He raised his estoc, preparing to finish Garvin, the blade gleaming with lethal precision. But just as he was about to strike, an axe came hurtling through the air. It flew with incredible speed, cutting through the space where his head had been only moments before. The young man tilted his head slightly to the side, narrowly avoiding the blade as it whizzed past him, embedding itself in a tree behind. The young man's eyes narrowed slightly, turning in the direction from which the axe had been thrown. His calm demeanor remained intact, but there was a faint spark of intrigue in his gaze. "Well," he murmured, "it seems I do not need to wait for too long."